This video was brought to you by Squarespace. We went from this to this, and I want to know why. From restaurants to houses and technology, you might have noticed that a lot of modern stuff looks kind of bland. Look at this McDonald's restaurant today versus 2009. Something changed and people have started to notice. Like, decades used to have a look. When you think of the 80s, you probably see something like this, and this for the 2000s. But what do things look like today? And why is it so much harder to picture? Well, grab some snacks because things took more than a few unexpected turns, and I had to ask some questions I never anticipated. When did this start? What happens to things like mascots? And are 2010's millennials to blame? Kind of, but not in the way you'd think. Design is constantly changing, and as you look back, you might notice that every decade has its own distinct visual identity, from the 80s to the 2000s. Unique graphic design styles, cars and clothing. But I've noticed that it's becoming harder to tell. You can no longer capture a decade's visual identity in a couple broad strokes. This really hit me when I asked myself a question I'd never really considered. What do the 2020s even look like? Compared to, say, the 80s, there is no unifying aesthetic or design language that jumps out as being representative of the decade. It's like there's less character. Everything blends into one homogeneous blob. You might have felt this too. Maybe you've wondered why so many companies have moved away from colourful branding to simplified logos and products. Anyway, I wanted answers. And luckily, I knew exactly where to start looking for them. Whether you grew up in the 80s or just watched a couple episodes of Stranger Things, you likely have a very strong mental image of the decade. Arcades, neon clothing, and crazy vibrant patterns. While romanticized and often exaggerated, the elements that make up this image didn't come from nowhere. For example, many of the bold geometric patterns can be traced back to the Memphis design movement, a product of an Italian architecture firm founded in 1981. The Memphis group paved the way for radical, rule-breaking interior design, with their jagged, colorful furniture. This shared a visual language with other trends at the time, having futuristic motifs and sharp angles that mirrored the emerging aesthetics of technology and pop culture. These styles were so distinct that we remember them decades later, and the 80s itself is characterized as vivid, energetic, and innovative. The 90s was different again, having more earthy tones and grungy graphic design. What it didn't lose was the rebellious and experimental spirit of the 80s. The rise of the early internet, alternative music, and the gaming explosion fueled this, leading to a lot more strange aesthetics. Over at the Consumer Aesthetics Research Institute, they've broken a lot of these down into categories which you may or may not remember. Take corporate grunge for example, with its textured backgrounds and edgy, distressed fonts. If you're as chronically online as me, you might have even heard of utopian scholastic, used in educational contexts, or even wacky homo. More on those here. But it's not like these were all super niche movements. They influenced the look of everything, from advertisements to TV shows. People weren't afraid to plaster mainstream products with the abstract and the surreal. Reaching the tail end of the 90s, you saw futurism take control. The 2000s were peaking around the corner and everyone made sure they looked the part. Sleek, chrome technology and clothing are reflected on today as markers of a more optimistic time. Naturally, the following decade held onto these themes, with the 2000s having more than its fair share of shiny, computer-generated shapes, futuristic fonts, and edgy marketing. Graphic design still had rules, but the rule of cool remained a priority. And so, stuff looked cool. Video games, movies, technology, even advertisements, which are fucking advertisements, were interesting. But it wasn't like there was only room for one approach. Dozens of identifiable aesthetics existed simultaneously, serving different purposes for different industries. Gaming looked extreme. Fashion looked slick and futuristic. Midway through the decade, as it became easier to render stuff in HD, certain markets began to adopt what is now referred to as Frutiger Aero, a glossy, skeuomorphic approach to UI. Fun fact, if you aren't a certified Frutigooner, you'll actually be unable to hit subscribe. Anyway, the 2000s was sort of the last decade with a really distinct, or at least memorable, visual style. As I continued digging, things kind of went downhill. The 2010s were an interesting time. They were the birthplace of some of the most memorable aesthetics, many for all of the wrong reasons. Things were more disjointed, scattered, corporate, and kind of soulless at times. You might be familiar with the look of millennial burger joints, corporate Memphis, the whole live, laugh, love bullshit, and many more. Now, we're gonna get into all of these, but we're also gonna find out who's responsible. Why and when did design start to change? Because things really started to tone down after the 2000s. Companies were chasing clean, inclusive, and neutral designs, which led to a lot of the stuff you interacted with taking on a more sanitized look. We'll start with an easy one: gaming. So, the Nintendo Switch 2 was recently revealed, and there's one big issue I've noticed that no one else seems to be talking about. This doesn't surprise me, because it's something that has been happening right in front of our faces for the last 10 years. But before we get there, I need to zoom out again, because there's a much bigger point about gaming that I want to make. Do you ever feel like most new games kind of blend in with each other? Not just gameplay wise, but visually. HUDs, UI, and graphics. It's like at some point, all of the graphic design flair that used to be tailor-made for games on an individual basis disappeared. Originally, I just wrote this off as nostalgia, but that was before I started looking a little closer. It turns out there is something going on, and things weren't always like this. You know we like the 2000s on this channel, so allow me to take you back once again. Back then, almost every game had its own visual style. The UI in Halo 3 was completely different to that of Burnout 3 or Tony Hawk's Underground. Even just look at the variety in something as simple as health bars. Devil May Cry 4, Halo 3. This is insane, but it works thematically and is definitely memorable. These kinds of ornamental, decorated user interfaces are great. They ensure the immersion isn't broken when you hit pause, making the game itself feel like more of a cohesive, complete, and unique package. Some studios really took risks with this, leading to some of the most fascinating displays of all time. Dead Space shows your health bar as a glowing green track running up your spine, and in-game menus like the store are projected holographically in front of your character. The key takeaway here is that there was no single right approach to UI, with its differences across games being an integral part of their visual identity and world building. The key word here is was, because today, there's a couple elements you can count on appearing in almost every game. Collections of semi-transparent rectangles, uninspired flat heads-up displays, and cluttered and overcomplicated menus. It sometimes feels like studios just finish their game, then send it off to a random third party that just copy and pastes the same bland interface onto all of them. There used to be a contrast between Halo and Call of Duty's menus that made sense considering their respective atmospheres. Now they share a design language that is far too similar and still manages to be less intuitive and interesting than their classic counterparts. But okay, maybe I'm just being nitpicky, right? We still do get games with expressive user interfaces, they're just pretty few and far between. Well, sure, but that doesn't excuse what's happened to consoles. And of course, my gripes with the Switch 2. Bang, PlayStation 2, Xbox, Xbox 360, the Wii, PlayStation 3, fuck it, the Wii U. Notice anything? They're all iconic and probably extremely nostalgic, but more importantly, they're different. The Wii was aimed at families and casual play. The UI is bubbly and inviting. The Xbox released as an energetic, edgy competitor to the PlayStation 2 and the GameCube. They all served a different purpose, and so they all looked different when you turned them on. To me, this is both creative and effective branding. This isn't. And you know what? Neither is this. But before I rip into this thing, a quick word from today's sponsor. Boring game UI is one thing, but a bland website for your business? That's risky. Whether you want to channel the 2000s or mix and match your own eye-catching aesthetics, Squarespace has everything you need and more. Thanks to their cutting-edge tools, a bespoke, personalized website is only a few clicks away. This isn't just a pretty, highly customizable facade though. You can kickstart a business selling your artwork or clothing, using their inbuilt analytics tool to oversee traffic and strategize. If you want to have a crack at making something cool yourself, you can get started with a free trial at squarespace.com. But if you want to start making moves, I've secured you 10% off your first website or domain at squarespace.com/extramint. The Nintendo Switch 2 sounds amazing. Apparently it's like 10 times more powerful than the original, being a clear step forward in many ways. If you ignore the price of the games and everything else, it's hard to point to any major flaws in its design. So you mortgage your house and buy one. It's your ticket into an exciting new era of gaming. After years of anticipation, speculation, and fruitagooning, it's finally in your hands. You boot it up and there it is. Another minimalist, sanitized menu screen. I don't get it. This is a fun, casual console. Why does it look so sterile and lifeless? They barely tried to differentiate it from the first, which would surely have been an easy way to get people more hyped about the newer product. Maybe you don't think this is a big deal, but console UI design used to reflect the culture. It tapped into something people were already connected to. I mentioned the Xbox and the Wii because both had clear cultural niches that were complemented by their interfaces. On the other hand, what does this reflect? Who is it for? In my opinion, opting for a revitalized approach to their main design language would go a long way in setting the Switch 2 apart from its predecessor and improving the overall atmosphere of the console. Now, I'll quickly mention themes because it's something I see people bring up quite a lot in these discussions, and rightfully so. They let you brighten up your UI on a more personal level, being popular on older hardware like the 3DS. There, you could apply a range of unique icons, backgrounds, and more. However, Nintendo ditched these for the first Switch, only featuring the equally minimal black and white options. It feels like a new console would be a great opportunity to introduce themes again and allow players to spice up their UI, but unless it's added later on, it doesn't seem like the Switch 2 will have these either. And it isn't surprising. The disappearance of personalization has been a trend for a long time, going hand in hand with these blander interfaces. The result of all of this is consoles that feel less like consoles and more like the waiting rooms of dentists' offices.
Just hanging around.
But let's bring this back a level because we still don't really know why this is happening to begin with. I had a deeper look and I'll be honest, you can probably guess the reason. Money. Not very satisfying? Alright. By the 2010s, developers started to understand and consolidate the best practices for UI. It turns out there are general principles you can follow for maximum engagement. Think thumbnails. After 20 years, we arrived at face in the middle, big text. The same goes for game interfaces. There, minimalism promotes clarity, speed, and usability, and the natural conclusion is menus becoming less of a canvas for creativity and more of a tool for efficiency. Boringly obvious boxes, no background distractions. Also, in the early days, consoles really needed to set themselves apart to compete. That's why the aesthetics of the Xbox were so different to the Wii. It helped customers understand the general identity and purpose of what they were buying. Family, Doritos and Mountain Dew. But these brands aren't new anymore, and the market is more mature. Integrating with online ecosystems and storefronts while remaining inoffensive and accessible has become a far more relevant goal. Companies don't see this as bland and boring, they see it as the most cost-effective and optimized option available, and that's why they choose it every time. But like I said, gaming is only a small piece of the puzzle. I'm pretty sure the rest are under my couch, so just give me a sec. We've all heard of millennial burger joints, right? Two guys with an idea so crazy that it just might work. Some brick walls, a chalkboard looking menu, $30 burgers, and don't forget this dude. I don't know who he is or where he comes from, but he'll be there. Anyway, this isn't the only thing millennials have been lumped in with. I've seen people talk about millennial tech companies, this art style, and last but not least, this shit. Aesthetically, they do share some common themes. They are usually minimalist, I don't like them, and I hate them. I'll talk about why that is, but I'm sure what you really want to know is where these came from and what they have to do with millennials. I'll start with possibly the most soulless, corporate Memphis. Now, to truly appreciate corporate Memphis, you have to understand where we came from and what we lost. Broadly referred to as Frutiger Aero today, the default corporate tech aesthetic in the 2000s looked something like this. Think Windows Vista. Over time though, spearheaded by the launch of Windows 8, we transitioned to flatter icons and interfaces. This happened in the early 2010s, and many people have since labeled this style Frutiger Metro. There's still a lot of color, layers, and references to nature, but it isn't as glossy and bubbly. Sure, these two looks aren't for everyone, but this is for no one. Corporate Memphis, with its basic colors and deformed humanoid figures, became the aesthetic of choice for companies everywhere in the late 2010s. It sucks. These images make me feel an intense existential dread. I can tell they've been manufactured to give off this playful vibe, which makes them feel all the more artificial. I don't know how you even achieve this, but it's offensively inoffensive. Remember that Grubhub ad from a few years back? That's kind of just this, but in 3D. Kroger. What is this? Interestingly though, this isn't the first time we've seen these kind of characters pop up in advertising. Global Village Coffee House is an aesthetic you probably recognize if you grew up in the 90s and very early 2000s. With its warm color scheme and earthy tones, it was popular in everything from commercials to interior design. We're talking cafes, restaurants, everything. More importantly though, it also had very similar abstract silhouettes as a recurring motif. So why do these feel so cozy and inviting, while these come off as bland and artificial? I mean, they're both corporate designs made with the express purpose of generating money. Well, I think it's pretty simple. Coffee House embraces imperfection and Memphis enforces conformity. The charm of this piece doesn't just come from the warm colors. There's texture, expression. You can tell that it was actually made by a real person with at least some agency over the output. The T and E overlap with other bold black lines. Colors reach beyond their borders, making the reds and oranges glow with a comforting warmth. With Memphis, no matter how quirky it tries to be, the existence of strict rules is painfully obvious. Its sleek geometric blobs are flat, rigid, and uninspired. You can't sell me a vibe if I can see right through the image to the focus group behind it. However you feel about this, it at least tried to hide them. Still, it gets worse, and you'll definitely be familiar with this next one. You can spot Live, Laugh, Love in way too many suburban homes. Characterized by the heavy use of this typeface, cringy slogans, and wine-obsessed mums, it popped up in the 2010s and is as strong as ever. After all, Live, Laugh, Love isn't just a slogan. It's a lifestyle. If you're in someone's house and they have it hanging on the wall somewhere, there's a good chance their living room looks like this. And maybe, if they're really committed, they'll have a pledge imprinted on some boards that starts with the words, "in this house," and ends with a snarky admittance of their crippling alcohol addiction. All that aside though, what the hell does any of this have to do with millennials? You always see their generation attached to these aesthetics online, but why is that? Is it their fault? I have a few theories, and I'd be interested to see if you guys agree. Firstly, millennials didn't really invent most of this stuff. Instead, I think the association mostly comes from them being in the right place at the right time. They were becoming adults in the 2010s, working in tech startups, furnishing their first apartments, and so on. But during this, the shift was already happening. Branding became flat and non-threatening. Minimalism and decluttering your lifestyle was in. Companies were pushing this out, and they just happened to be the most relevant demographic. So, all these years later, they're still associated with it. There's also the possibility that they genuinely liked it. At the time, perhaps this clean look felt like a breath of fresh air. After years of extreme, in-your-face branding and maximalist aesthetics, I can understand why you'd turn to a dialed-back look when finally decorating your own house or business. And let's be reasonable, ain't nothing wrong with living, laughing, and loving. Here's a McDonald's 20 years ago, and here's one today. Oh, it's actually a Wendy's. Why do they look the same? The strangest thing about this minimalist obsession is the fact that it's seeped into literally everything, even places where it just doesn't make sense. Today, it's harder than ever to tell two chains apart. Everyone uses the same combination of grey cubes, with little variation in materials and presentation. There's a kind of surprising reason for this, but to set the stage, let's revisit what we came from. Locations used to look a lot more playful and cartoony. Granted, this wasn't always done well, hence this image and this one. But you know, they were trying. Come the 2010s, this started to change. The McDonald's mascots were slowly phased out. Interiors started to look a lot more like an IKEA showroom. Muted shades of grey and white took over. The YouTuber Chon put it best. It kind of does look like Minecraft. Anyway, you can attribute a lot of this switch to fast food companies' attempts to rebrand and capture a larger audience. We all know that none of it is healthy, but you get rid of a little bit of that stigma when you sell food out of a clean-looking, modernized building. As an adult, you feel less guilty ordering a double quarter pounder and 20 nuggets when the place doesn't look like it was made explicitly for children. Also, the way people order food has changed drastically over the past few decades. With things like Uber Eats, less people are even going inside to begin with, giving companies another reason to not bother spicing things up. But enough about fast food. When was the last time you walked into a retail store like this? These were all real places from the 90s and 2000s. Some for gaming, others for clothing and luxury items. Many were experimental, leaning into futuristic themes and aesthetics. This Xbox store looks like the inside of a UFO, and this, the only PlayStation store to ever exist, is just amazing. Admittedly, these sorts of places weren't everywhere. You still had your bog standard GameStops and so on, but these at least existed. Back then, there wasn't such a uniform approach to designing a storefront. mind. You might have heard of Utopian Scholastic, an aesthetic that contrasted these more futuristic themes and popped up more in libraries and those sciencey geographic shops. I still remember the first time I walked through one of these places. Really unique vibe. Point is, we no longer have this kind of range or variety when it comes to shopping. There are still differences across markets and brands, but they are A, less pronounced, and B, kind of dull. Just look at Hot Topic today versus the 2000s. Would it have really hurt that much to at least keep the font? Major retailers now go for safer, simplistic layouts that blend in and can be quickly torn down and rebranded. It's weird because you'd think the goal would be to set yourself apart from everyone else to create a unique and memorable shopping environment. But clearly that's not it. So what is it? To start off, we need to talk about Apple, but I'm not going to be glazing them like the last video. Their role in all of this is small, but not insignificant. Whenever you go into one of their stores, you'll notice how premium everything feels. It isn't by accident. They're spacious, bright, and clean with simple wooden benches and the products on full display. It matches their devices, advertising, everything. Apple has spent years refining and building this narrative, making minimalism feel premium and luxurious. And it works. It complements people's growing desire to declutter and simplify their workspaces, and feels right at home in the generic modern house. However, Apple showed everyone else that simple could now mean premium. Many other retailers would go on to adopt this look, with the goal of creating streamlined retail experiences that capitalized on this association. Of course, Apple isn't the only reason for this, I just think there's a pretty clear influence there. A bigger, more obvious cause is the shift to online stores. When a significant amount of your sales are done online, it doesn't make as much sense to spend money creating a unique physical display. Plus, what if that location fails? It's easier to drop a new retailer into an existing space if that space doesn't have custom architecture left over from the last owner. Case in point, the entire former Pizza Hut subreddit. I'm sure you've seen this graphic. It shows the distribution of car colors by year, with grey and white becoming increasingly common with time. But color isn't the only area where cars have changed. If you remember this kind of car photography, real Top Gear, or just own a car, I think this next section is going to be particularly interesting. Because nothing I've talked about in this video looks as boring and uninspired as modern cars. What were once both beautiful and beautifully ugly have become predictable and expressionless. My personal favorite era stretched from the late 90s to the early 2000s, where cars were photographed in a very distinct way. It looked like they were always in front of a sunset, with the golden glow nicely highlighting the curves of even the most unexciting vehicles. Sports cars got some of the most edgy and adrenaline-pumping commercials of all time, going completely overboard in ways you do not see today. But the advertising wasn't doing all the work. There was simply a more diverse selection of cars aimed at satisfying a larger number of niches. You had a range of small turbocharged sports cars at multiple price points. There were other, more sensible options for families. Today, these niches have shriveled up, being condensed into a handful of crossovers that try to be a little bit of everything and end up representing not much at all. Nothing screams there's an absolute dickhead driving me anymore. Almost. Instead, we've got a bunch of vaguely premium, vaguely sporty cars that blend together into a homogeneous grayscale blob. The only thing that isn't vague is the price for any of them. The reason for all of this is far from a secret. These generic, inoffensive designs are mass marketable, helping companies save on design costs, meet safety regulations, and focus on what really matters. Putting a bunch of random bullshit screens and Fortnite backwards compatible vibrating rose toy, fidget toy, ADHD custom engraving. So, after all of this, what do I think? What's really going on here? First off, the 2020s definitely have a look. It's just largely centered around a single philosophy: minimalism. Companies don't care about showing off how cool their thing is anymore. They know we're just gonna use it anyway. I also think that minimalism made sense for a while, providing a nice contrast to the more chaotic nature of, say, older web design. But the existence of stuff like this tells me it might have overstayed its welcome. Because the biggest issue I have with minimalism is how restrictive it is. When the dominant approach to design implicitly sets boundaries on expressiveness and clutter, it de-incentivizes experimentation. For graphic designers at these corporations, they're still following general rules. It's just that now they reward simplicity and seamless, almost invisible integration into our environments. In other words, things look bland on purpose. But this won't last forever. Making this video, it became clear that nostalgia isn't the only reason people miss older periods of design. There was a certain energy around advertisements, video games, cars, and architecture that you can only replicate by cutting people loose and experimenting. Perhaps it's time to start doing that again.